Hello and welcome. My name is Beth Reed, and today I'm creating my very first video tutorial demonstrating a technique for picking up stitches along a slip stitch edge. This is a technique used in my Auntie's Hug shawl, shown here. And it is the way that I created this line of stitches along the sides of this cable band. This particular shawl, you first knit the cable band from end to end, and once that's complete and bound off, you come back and you pick up stitches along this edge and work downward to create this fluted rib that creates a flared edge. It's not a true ruffle, but it does have a flare to it, so it curves nicely across your back. And then you'll come back and pick up stitches along this edge of the cable band and work upward in stockinette in order to create the upper part of the shawl. Now, if you notice, this has a nice visible line of demarcation here and here, and that's because of the specific technique used to create this slip stitch edge. So I want to show you the different types of edging on this practice piece that I've created. I didn't bother weaving in all the ends, so please try to ignore those. This is a typical, not a slip stitch edge, but a typical edge where you knit the first and last stitch of every row, so that there is one edge stitch for every row of your work. And that is the most common edge to use when you are picking up stitches along an edge. It's a fairly stable edge. There's not a lot of elasticity to it. And there are times when that's exactly what you want. I'll be demonstrating this against a reverse stockinette background today because that's what we have here in the shawl, is reverse stockinette meeting stockinette, or meeting the ribbing. So when you pick up stitches along this edge with a typical knitted edge, if you're going from reverse stockinette to stockinette as you are here, this is your line of join, and if you look, it's very subtle as it changes from one to the other. I think more so with the reverse stockinette than even with the stockinette, because with the stockinette the change in direction of your stitches is visible, where when you're working in the reverse stockinette, your line of ridges kind of lines up with your columns of stitches there. So there are times this is exactly what you want in a design. But there are times when you want something a little bit different, as I did here. I really wanted to set off this cable band. I didn't want to throw in another stitch pattern in here. I didn't want to do anything that would be so busy that it would detract from the cable. But I did want to kind of accentuate that section. So this is just a very simple way of doing that. Now, this is a slip stitch edge, and if you look, you'll see that it almost looks like a crocheted chain stitch edge, and actually that's almost exactly what it is, although you work it with knitting needles. So today I want to show you the way to go about creating that. If you look, again, here's our typical edge. You can see there's these little bumps along this edge every so often. Every second stitch, actually, there's a row of bumps along that edge, and there's just it's not a very elegant edge, in my opinion. It's fine, and it serves its purpose very well, but it's not the prettiest edge. So anytime that I am leaving an edge without any further work, like without an I-cord binding or something like that, it tends to be this slip stitch edge because it is a more clean look to me. So again, I'm going to be working against the stockinette background here, and Today I'm working on short bamboo DPNs because they just work well for the space here in front of the camera. I do typically work almost everything on stainless steel circulars, and I tend to tension my yarn a little bit more than most people do because I have arthritic hands and it's hard for me to keep a tight grip on my yarn. If you look closely here, you'll notice where I rode out a little bit as I was purling back on that row, and that's just life for me. So I'm having a little bit of a bad hand day, so forgive me if my knitting isn't up to my usual standard. I typically, when I'm picking up stitches using this technique, if I'm doing this, I usually use just my knitting needle. It's simple enough to do. But for this specific technique, it is easier for me if I use a crochet hook. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. I think that's good. So I want to use the smallest crochet hook that I'm comfortable using with the yarn, where I'm not splitting the yarn with every stitch, because I'm going to be working into some tighter spaces, and if I were using a crochet hook of a more typical size like so, there's spots there that it would be just really awkward to work in because I'll be doing some of this. So again, I recommend a smaller crochet hook. This is a size, I don't know if you can see that or not, but there we go. That's a size E. I probably would be comfortable using an F, but much bigger than that and it gets a little awkward. So when you first start, and I've gone ahead and picked up the corner stitches, I always add an extra stitch in the corner, and that's because as you're working, you typically will want a nice straight line along this edge as you continue, and if you don't have an extra stitch in that corner, quite often it'll pull in there a little bit and you'll get a little bit of a scallop, and I don't like that, and I would much rather pick up an extra stitch here and then decrease it out in the middle somewhere on the following row if I have too many stitches. So that's not always true for every design, but it is something to keep in mind and to keep an eye on. So I'm going to try to twist this so you can see where I'm putting my hook here. So if you look at these slip stitches, we have a leading edge here, and we have a leading leg, I should say, and a back leg. And we're going to be always working into that back leg, and that allows this front leg, this leading leg, to roll forward, and doing so is what creates this nice line of demarcation at that transition from working one direction to working the other. So if I picked up just that one leg, you can see how that's got a tendency to stretch out, and as this shawl is hanging on your body, it's a heavy enough shawl that it would definitely stretch that loop out, and you'd get a little row of eyelets there that you didn't intend to. And I don't like that look in this particular instance. So what I'm going to do is pick up not just this loop, you see that? But I'm also going to reach through there and I'm going to grab one of the legs of the stitch behind it. So I'm actually going through two loops on this. I'm going to grab my yarn and pull it through. Now I knit Western mount, so I want to be sure that the leading leg of this stitch that I've formed is on the front of my needle. If you knit Eastern mount, obviously you would reverse that. Now that is the way that you would pick up the first stitch. The second stitch is going to be different, because if we did the same thing On the next one, as we did there, we would only get 1 stitch for every 2 rows, and I really want one every row on this because I don't want any inward pull on this section because it would interfere with the drape of the shawl the way it's designed. So I'm going to go through, see if I can tip this. I'm going to go through that same loop, not both of the loops, just the loop on this stitch that's rolled over, and then I'm going to twist my hook and go through that loop on the next stitch as well. So I'm creating a stitch in the overlap between those 2 slip stitches, and that would be my second stitch that I've formed. So I've gone the width of 1 slip stitch here, but I've picked up 2 stitches. So the next one, I'm going to go through, you've got your second slip stitch here, so I'm going to go through the loop of that and also grab the loop of the stitch behind it and pull through both of those. And again, be careful to mount it according to your particular knitting style. Let me see if I can't prove that. Nope, that's not as good. My camera doesn't seem to know which color to focus on, the light in the foreground or the dark in the background. So now, so that's my, ignore these first 2, those are my corner stitches. So that's the third one I've picked up, and every even numbered one is going to be in the overlap. So I'm going to find the back leg of the actual slip stitch there, and then I'm going to go through the back leg of the next slip stitch for the one that's in that overlap. Mount that on my needle, and you can already see after just 2 slip stitches worth how we're getting that line of demarcation that we're looking for right along that edge. Okay. So the next one is an odd number, which means it's going to be through the actual stitch loop and its backdoor neighbor. So we're going to pull that through. Whoop. And then the next one goes through the overlap between the 2 stitches. And then through the loop and its backdoor neighbor again. So here we are with 2, 4, 6, 7. That was an odd number. It's 7. So the even number is in the overlap between this stitch and the next stitch. There's 8. I think I'm going to go about 12 stitches wide in this demonstration. So we are at the odd number, so it goes through the stitch and its backdoor neighbor. And then the even number goes between it and the overlap. It goes through the overlap. Sorry. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So I'm going to stop there. Now this yarn that I'm working with for this demo, this is a Red Heart Super Saver. I keep it around just exactly for this type of a thing. If I'm doing a practice piece or I'm swatching a stitch pattern to see if I want to use it in a design or that type of thing. It's a good workhorse yarn for the type of thing that you don't necessarily need to keep. I don't usually use it in anything that's going to be worn against my skin. I find it a little bit scratchy for that. Although this particular practice piece, you can see how nicely it's blocked out. I steam blocked it for a few minutes on the ironing board, the iron doesn't come in contact with it, you hold it just above and just use a burst of steam on it, and that relaxes the stitches. And it also slightly melts the acrylic that's in it, which permanently blocks it. So for some things I do use a premium acrylic, which is what this is made out of, and so that I can steam block it and set it permanently. The steam blocking also makes it much softer, so it's much more wearable. I tend to prefer animal fibers and natural fibers for my own use, but there are times when I'm making something for someone else that I know that they either won't block it or won't hand wash it, or possibly won't do either one. And if that's the case, then I may use a higher grade acrylic so that it won't matter and will still look good. So at this point you can see very nicely you've got that nice line of demarcation there. I'm going to quickly knit a few rows on this just so you can see how that transition looks. Now I am a continental knitter when I knit from right to left normally. Quite often when I am knitting from left to right, I continue to tension in my left hand and work across the right side of the work rather than turning it. So when I do that, I tend to throw my yarn English style. And my understanding of the terms English and continental is not whether you're working in your right hand or your left hand, or whether you're tensioning with your right hand or your left hand. Sorry, gotta fix my tension issues here. But if you're tensioning with the same hand as holds your working needle. So if that is true, if I understand that correctly, this would be English style, even though I'm tensioning with my left hand, because my working needle is my left. So I'm just quickly working back across, not as quickly as normal because, as I said, this is a bad hand day for me. Whoops. And I learned to knit backwards just by sitting down one day and experimenting till I figured it out. Took me a little bit to figure out how not to twist my purl stitches, but I typically can purl quicker backwards than forwards at this point. I'm not going to worry too much about the tension on that right now. A lot of that extra tension is because of my tail being unbound at this point. Obviously I knit much faster continental than I do in reverse. I learned to knit continental because my father taught me to knit, and that's what he had learned. He learned to knit and crochet both while he was in the military, stationed in Greenland. He learned from some of the locals. Apparently there were times when he might be the only person above ground for a week at a time, or close to it, as he was working in the radio shack. And the rest of the base during the winter time would be snowed in, and they would move around through tunnels, from my understanding. So he taught me both to knit and crochet, and this is the continental style, working from right to left is the way that he taught me. So just a couple more stitches here. Whoops. Come here, you. Okay, so, and please excuse the unevenness of those stitches. So you can see here, I hope you can see here, let me see. So here's your reverse stockinette going into your stockinette section. And just look what a nice clean line of demarcation there is. It's just so nicely set off by that. And it also tends to, if you can see here, this edge is kind of a little bit wonky, and it just straightens that out so nicely. And got a nice edge there, no stitches pulled out of shape where there's creating loops against the row behind. And then on the back side you have a very unobtrusive joint there, where on this one again there's no delineation, or very little delineation, between your reverse stockinette and your stockinette section, and you have a fairly strong ridge here on the back side. So that is how to pick up stitches along that slip stitch edge, and we're picking up 2 stitches for every 1 slip stitch to create a nice full section above it. Now if I were didn't want this to widen out, then on that second row I pick up my stitches, and then on the next row as I come back, about every 4th stitch I would knit 2 together or do a slip slip knit in order to reduce the number of stitches, because typically your stitches are wider than they are tall. So you can see already this is flaring a little bit. In this particular application I wanted that flare, so that's why I did that. If you don't want that flare, like I said, every 3 or 4 stitches, just whatever it takes to reduce the width to match the width of this below it, you would just do a decrease. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions or comments, just leave those messages for me below the video, or you can contact me on Ravelry. This particular design has not yet been released for sale. It's still undergoing testing. I hope to release it sometime, hopefully by the end of November of this year, 2017. If not, definitely by Christmas. And we'll probably run a knit along for this particular pattern when I first release it, and then later just release it for general sale. And it would be a 4-section knit along for first the cable band, then the flared rib border, and then the the stockinette upper portion, and then the finishing details, which include an I-cord band around all except for this bottom edge, a button and an I-cord button loop. Sorry, I'm showing it inside out here. And a shawl style collar section. So keep your eye out for that. Again, I'm hoping to release it fairly soon, and we'll have updates about that in my Beth A. Reed Designs forum group on the Ravelry forums. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope this is helpful for you. Goodbye.